Hello everyone, it's Crystal. Welcome to part 5 of the Library Quilt Along. In this video we will discuss quilting your quilt. Our quilt top is finished and now it's time to quilt the quilt. We have 5 options for quilting our quilt. We can send it off to the spa. That means we send it out to a long armor. If we decide to send our quilt top out to a long armor, the long armor will tell us how to prepare our quilt for quilting. We can quilt our quilt by hand. I don't sew by hand. I don't quilt by hand, so I don't have any tips for you in that regard. We can quilt our quilt on a domestic sewing machine. If you have a walking foot, then you can make sure that you have all 3 layers going through your sewing machine evenly. If you have a sewing machine that will allow you to lower the feed dogs, you can do free motion quilting. If you have your own long arm machine, well then you probably don't need any tips from me. I am actually in the process of researching long arm machines. When my husband and I buy our next home, I hope I have enough space for a long arm quilting machine. If you've seen the video of my sewing room tour, you know that it's tight down here. I don't have a lot of space. I can't add any more machines as much as I would like to. I just can't add a long arm quilting machine right now. So now I'm just researching and I'm saving to buy it once I have more space. And finally, you can quilt your quilt on an embroidery machine. And that's how I quilted a quilt I did for my husband for Father's Day in 2020. It was a 60 by 70 inch quilt. I quilted it on my embroidery machine. So for this quilt, my library quilt is 60 by 84. So I'm going to quilt it on my embroidery machine. I moved my embroidery machine to a different area of my craft room. I put it on my cutting table, my work table. So hopefully I won't have as many problems as I had when I quilted my husband's Father's Day quilt. So in this video, we will calculate the batting and backing fabric we need for our quilt. I will show you how to make your quilt sandwich if you are quilting your quilt yourself and not sending it out to a long armor. So let's get started. So if you are going to quilt your quilt yourself, you need to create your quilt sandwich. First, you need to take some measurements. So my quilt is 60 inches wide and 84 inches long. Depending on your method, you may want to add somewhere between 2 to 4 inches around each side. For this quilt, I'm going to add 4 inches on each side to make my quilt sandwich. So you can add, some people add 2 inches for the batting and then another 3 inches or so for the backing. It depends. If you want your batting to match your backing fabric, it all depends on your style and what method you're using. But I like to have my batting just slightly smaller than my backing fabric. So I'm going to add 4 inches on each side. So I'm going to add 8 to this. So 68 times 92. This is going to be my batting. And then I may just add another 2 inches for my backing. So that's 70 by 94. And that will be our back fabric. So I'm going to quilt my quilt on my embroidery machine. So I need a lot of extra length because I'm going to quilt from the top, but I also need to have space in my hoop for any extra fabric to make sure I get all of the area of the quilt. So once again, for my particular quilt sandwich, and you can play around with it depending how big your quilt is. If your quilt is, say for instance, you have a small quilt, something you're going to hang on the wall, you may only want to add 3 inches total. You may want to add 4 inches total. So it depends on the size of your quilt top, and it depends on how you were actually quilting it. So play around with the measurements and do what's most comfortable for you. But for my library quilt, I'm going to add 4 inches on each side. So I'm adding 8 inches to the width and 8 inches to the length. So that's going to give me a batting of 68 by 72. Excuse me, 68 by 92. And then I'm going to add just 2 more inches so that the backing is just slightly bigger. So that gives me a back fabric of 70 by 94. And I bought backing fabric that is 108 inches wide. So this is covered here, and I just need to cut this a little less than 2 yards. Next, I will show you how to get your quilt sandwich ready for your machine. My quilt sandwich is too big to place on the table under the camera. So I have these scrap pieces here that I just wanted to give you a visual about how to make your quilt sandwich. So the first thing I do when I make a quilt sandwich, this is my back fabric. I make sure it's pressed with no creases. And this is solid, but your pretty side will be facing out. So pretty side facing out. And then I take my batting and I place it near the center. It doesn't have to be exact because your top of your quilt is even smaller than this. And this blue turquoise represents the top of my quilt. And then I would place it, and I'm always smoothing as I go. Start from the center and smooth to the sides. Start from the center and smooth top and bottom. So if this is a quilt and you're going to quilt it on your domestic sewing machine, you can buy a spray based. If you buy a spray base, just make sure you have enough ventilation to use it. I am in a basement, so I don't have any ventilation down here, so I can't use any spray basting. And I'm going to quilt my library quilt on my embroidery machine, so I don't need to do pins because that will get in the way of my hooping and my needle. But if you're on a domestic sewing machine, you need to pin because there's a lot of shifting and moving around. So you always start in the middle. These are safety pins. These are quilt safety pins. Open up your safety pin, you start in the middle and go through all 3 layers and pin. Then you go out to one side. I'm going to go out to the left. Pin, you usually pin, for a large quilt, I usually pin 4 fingers across, so that's about 3 inches. Usually do every 3 inches. And then I would go all the way to the edge. And then I would come back to the middle and go to the other side. About 3 inches across, put your pin in, and make your quilt sandwich. Then once you're all the way over, then you come back to the middle and you do another row. So if this is my second row, put my pin in and repeat. Go to the left, one more. Come back to the middle and now go to the right. So you would do that for your entire quilt if you're quilting it on your domestic machine. If you are planning to do maybe straight line quilting or maybe just a serpentine stitch all over, start in the middle, go to the end, but start in the middle of the quilt so that you can always smooth out as you quilt your quilt. And if you turn it over, you see that it's where the pins are. So as you're quilting, just make sure you smooth out as you go. And I have these gloves that I wear when I do quilting on my domestic sewing machine. This helps me grip. There's rubber on the tips of the gloves, and it helps me to grab the quilt as I'm going. So you can do safety pin basting or you can do spray basting. I wouldn't just wing it because these fabrics do shift. The batting does keep it together well for the most part, but add something to it, either safety pins or spray basting. So I will show you how my quilt looks on the embroidery machine as I am doing my end-to-end quilting design from Designs by Juju.